Welcome to LearnHowToQuilt.com. I'm Ann, and this is the 14th video in our Star Sampler series. Today we'll be working on another 12-inch block called the Swamp Angel. You might be thinking that this looks like an Ohio star, and you're right. However, there's this what I call ribbon that goes through the star points, which makes it a little bit different. I chose this block because there's lots of opportunities here for working on your accuracy. Now you might know some quick methods for making these star points, but sometimes those methods might not help you with your accuracy. So today I'm going to be talking about sewing bias edges and how to make a plan to get around that. And I'll also be talking about how pressing your block can make it easier to construct. Now this video is a little bit longer than I'd like it to be, so I've labeled each section, and if you want to skip ahead, you just click on the links below. So come on in and let's get started. You'll find these cutting and sewing directions at LearnHowToQuilt.com under Quilt Classes, and then scroll down to the Star Sampler, or click on the links below. To make this star, you'll just need a few scraps of fabric and assorted lights, mediums, and darks. And you probably won't need any scrap larger than about 10 inches. Before choosing your fabric, you might want to first color in one of the stars because there's lots of different combinations. Depending on where you put your lights and your darks, you might end up getting something a little bit different than my star. I'll be using the same value placements as seen as this original star. These darks will be my star points. This will be my center. This off-white will be the square around the center. Then this light and medium fabric will be in each one of the corners. I've given you the cutting sizes on this sheet, but I always recommend drawing out your block just to double check it ahead of time. Now this is a 12-inch block, so if I wanted to draw it to size, I'd need 12-inch graph paper, but that's not necessary. I often use 8.5 by 11-inch graph paper just to make sketches of sections of the block. And later on I can use these to double check my cutting and my sewing. But today I'm going to use this for a little discussion about bias versus straight of grain or cross grain. Now this block is divided into 3 equal sections going down and 3 sections going across. Each one of these squares measures 4 inches. So I've duplicated those on this paper. I've got the center here at 4 inches. I know that to get the cutting size, I just add 1/2 inch for the seam allowance all the way around. Now you notice that the rest of these pieces are all triangles. These larger ones in the corner and then these smaller ones in groupings of 4. These triangles might be different sizes, but they all have something in common. They're all right angle triangles and they have 2 equal sides. Quilters have different names for these triangles. If you take 2 of these triangles and cut them on the diagonal, then they're referred to as half-square triangles, and the straight of grain and cross grain are on these 2 equal sides. If you take a square and cut it on both diagonals, then you end up with 4 triangles. The straight of grain will be on the outside edges of each one of these triangles, unlike these half-square triangles where the straight of grain is in the corner. So you might be saying, well, why is this all important and what does this have to do with drawing up this and figuring out cutting sizes? Well, you really want to try to avoid sewing bias edges to bias edges. When I sew these 4 triangles together, the bias edges are here. So I'll be sewing bias to bias to bias to bias, and this can get very wavy and bumpy in the middle, especially when you have to match this point here. Now on these 2, I'll be sewing bias to bias, but I don't have to match any points in the center here. So you want to try to avoid all this bias here. So let's look over at my drawing. So I definitely want this straight of grain on this outside edge here. That means that this edge right here is bias and this edge over here is bias. So I don't want to sew bias to bias. So if I can get the straight of grain here and the straight of grain here, that'll make it a little bit easier. So you can see that if I get the straight of grain in this corner, this is going to be a half square triangle. But then again, I've got the bias here and the bias here. It's not as big a deal as this center, but let's see. If I put a half square triangle here, half square triangle there, then I've got straight of grain on this side going against the bias on that side. So that comes down to this triangle right here. And I'll make it just like this one. If I put the straight of grain right here, then that means I'll have the bias against the straight of grain, the bias against the straight of grain, and that'll be okay. And then in this outside corner here, I'll add, I want the straight of grain there, so that also is going to be a half square triangle. So the formula for half square triangles is to add 7/8 of an inch to the finished size, which happens to be 4 inches. And so these triangles in the corner, you're going to cut 4 7/8 inches. And I'm going to come back to that in a second. Now these triangles here are going to be quarter square triangles. To cut quarter square triangles, you add 1 1/4 inches. The length on this side is 4 inches. So 4 plus 1 1/4 inches means that you're going to cut, this is getting really messy, you're going to cut a square 5 1/4 inches, and then you're going to cut that square on both of the diagonals. And you'll do that for this triangle and this triangle. So you see over here that you're going to be cutting them 5 1/4. To figure out the cutting sizes of these, I had to find this measurement. I can use my ruler to measure that, and I come up with 2 7/8. And so these half square triangles are going to be 2 7/8 plus 7/8 inches. When you add that together, it's 3 3/4. And so you'll cut those 3 3/4 inches big, and then you'll cut them in half on the diagonal. Now you might be wondering why I told you to cut 4 7/8 inches, but down here I have that as 5 inches. And that's because when you sew 2 half square triangles together like this to form a square, you don't have to be so precise as cutting them out at 4 7/8 inches. Round that up to 5 inches, and then I'll cut it down. I'll show you that later. So hopefully if you cut these out as half square triangles and these as quarter square triangles, it'll help keep your block nice and flat, and it'll help with your sewing accuracy. For the center, cut 1 square at 4 1/2 inches. For B, you want to cut 1 square at 5 1/4 inches and then cut on both diagonals. For C and D, you want to cut 2 squares each at 3 3/4 inches, and then you want to cut them on the diagonals. When you lay these out, you want to make sure that the straight of grain and cross grain goes against this bias. For E, you want to cut 2 5-inch squares and then cut them on the diagonal. You want to do the same thing for F, 2 5-inch squares and then cut them on the diagonal. And for EE, I use the same fabric as E. I cut 1 5 1/4 inch square and I cut it on both diagonals. When you have your block all laid out, you're ready to sew. I'll start with these star point units. I'll sew the B's to the C's. Now this is very easy to get this mixed up because this side and this side look the same. And so you want to immediately put a pin here, or what I like to do is I always hold the side to be sewn in my right hand. And when I put it down, I always put the side to be sewn on the right side. Next, you want to take these two triangles, put right sides together, and I'll be sewing on this side. So I'll stack it up like that. So I'll lay these down. The side to be sewn is right here. Before sewing, you want to make sure that all the edges are lined up. Make sure you don't pull or push your fabric, because remember, at least one of these sides is on the bias, and you want to be careful with that. Let me take these over to press. So I press these seams to the C piece and the D piece. You might be saying, well, it looks like you've just pressed to the dark. Well, in this case, it is the dark, but depending on where you place your values, it might not necessarily be pressed to the dark. In the next section, I'll give you some more information about how pressing can help with your accuracy. So I'll put right sides together, making sure to match the seam. I can feel when the seams butt up against each other. Want to line up these edges. Make sure you start off with a leader, because it's real easy for your machine to eat up this point here. Remember, when you sew on that bias, the least amount of handling, the better it is. So that looks good at the intersection. Let me take this over and press. I press this seam towards the B and C pieces, and then I'll trim off these corners. At this time, this piece should measure 4.5 inches square. You'll need to make 3 more of these. To sew these corner units, you'll want to put right sides together, line up all the edges, and then stitch. Remind yourself that this is all bias that you're sewing on. I took this to the ironing board and I pressed towards F. Now these are the 4 corner pieces, and they're going to have to be cut down a little bit. These squares were originally cut at 5 inches instead of 4 7/8 inches. The larger size allows me to trim this down to the perfect square. So I start off by putting the diagonal on my ruler over the diagonal on my square. I line that up, and I want to make sure that I have a little extra fabric down here at the 4.5 mark and a little extra over here at the 4.5 mark, and then I trim. Take my square, turn it around. Now I've got these edges lined up on my mat. Line up the ruler diagonal with the diagonal on my piece, and then I want to be at 4.5 down here and 4.5 inches over here on the side. And when everything's lined up, the bottom, the side, and this diagonal, I'm ready to cut. And there's my perfect 4.5 inch corner. When I start working with beginner groups, I always remind them that their accuracy is based on not only their cutting and sewing, but also their pressing. Some people like to press their seams open, but I like to press for what's called ease of construction. For example, when I put these 2 pieces together, I have to line up this seam. If I've pressed in opposite directions, then when I put this together here, I can feel those seams nestle up against each other, and it makes it really easy to line everything up. On my patterns, I sometimes include arrows that show which direction to press, but not all patterns show pressing directions, so you're left to figure it out for yourself. So I like to use a sketch of the pattern and a highlighter to figure out which way the seams are going to need to be pressed. I'll start off here. When I sew B to C, if I press in this direction, then for an opposing seam, I'll want to press towards D. And now I come over here. When I sew these 2 sections together, I'll want this seam to be pressed. So let me go around and draw that in. And I'll draw in pressing to C, and I'll draw in pressing to D. And so far, everything works out when I get into these spots. The pressing is in opposite directions. But now I need to figure out what to do with these seams. And I see that if I press in this direction, I'll have opposing seams here and here. So let me draw that in. And now all I have to worry about are these seams here. And usually I wait to see what happens after I've sewn everything else together. But I can tell that this seam's going to want to go in this direction. So I'll put this one in this direction and this one in this direction. This seam will want to go in this direction. This seam will want to go here. And you might be saying, well, how do you know that? Well, this is flat here. There's no stitching, but there's two seams here. And the bulk of this is going to want to fall towards this. So let me put that in and that in. These last two rows, I'll either open or press whichever direction they want to fall. It won't make that much difference because I'm not worried about what I'm going to match this to right now. And that's my pressing scheme. Now I'm ready to sew each one of these 3 rows. I'll start off by putting right sides together, the first 2 pieces. Then I'll stack these up, hold them in my right hand, and take them over to the sewing machine to stitch. The only matching that you have to worry about is when you put this top and bottom row together, you'll want to match this seam to this seam. I followed my pressing guide. I press these seams out, these seams in, and these seams out. I have opposing seams all the way through. Now I have some matching to do. I'll need to match this area, this area, this area, and this area on each of these rows. Each of these points should be about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. I just noticed that this point's a little bit further away, but I think I see where the problem is. It has to do with the way this was pressed. Can you see where I've pressed some extra fabric in there? So I need to take this back over to the ironing board and get that pressed properly. Oh, that's much better. So I'll take and put right sides together. First thing I want to do is match these end seams, pin. Now in this next section, I need to match these 2 points. So I stuck a pin at the top of this point, and I'm going to go straight across into the top of this point. Put those together like that. And with these opposing seams, everything sort of nestles in. Pin on this side, come over here and pin on this side. Pull that pin out, come down to this next spot where I've got 2 points that need to meet. And let me see, instead of putting a pin in here, let me see if I can just eyeball it that they're meeting right up against each other. Oh, that looks pretty good. Put a pin in there. I'll come to the very end here. You can feel those seams nestling in up against each other, and I'll pin that. Now I just took this over and sewed 1/4 inch from the side, but in the last couple videos I've shown you some other ways that you can put these sections together. You could hand base this first just to make sure that you've got all your points matching, or you can come in and just sew this section and this section and then sew the rest. So let's check and see what this looks like. So I've got matching there. This looks pretty good. It's not dead on, but pretty close. When I press this, it'll look more like it's matching there. And this one's pretty close. Let's see, I think that's a piece of fuzz and a piece of thread in there. And this last one is good. So I'll put right sides together and finish sewing this block up. And here's my completed block. At this point, it should measure 12.5 inches by 12.5 inches. Hope you get a chance to try one of these stars. It's a good project for tuning up your accuracy. Don't forget to stay tuned to the next video in this series. We'll be working on the sun ray star that uses a different type of triangles to make these star points. In the meantime, you might want to review our video about different triangles and their cutting formulas. You can find the link below. Thanks for visiting LearnHowToQuilt.com. Please like, subscribe, and share our videos with your friends. Remember, if you're trying to find us on the internet, type in LearnHowToQuilt.com. Don't forget the .com. Using the .com will get you right to our site.